Well, that's not that good. Thank you. Thank you, Karina. Okay, so I know it's getting late. I know it's a beautiful day outside. I'm going to do something. So my name is Paolo Gaudiano. I'm going to spend about 10, 12 minutes talking very quickly about the work that I do. And I think that I wasn't necessarily going to do that initially, but I think that you'll find it very interesting, especially in relation to some of the conversations that we've been hearing. And then we're going to just wrap up by telling you about this thing that James and I have been working on. Really, James has been doing all the work. I just kind of did some of the hacking in the back about how do we map the DI industry. And I do want to talk about, before I give any presentation, I want to talk about one thing, which is the white elephant in the room, and that's me. I always like to joke with people. It's like, what am I doing talking? You know, I am white male, cisgender, heterosexual, no permanent disabilities. And so I have all the privilege in the world. So what am I doing talking about DI? The way that I got into DI was I've been working in this space for about 10 years. Before that, I started as a professor. A long time ago, I was a professor from 1991 until 1999 doing AI, neural networks, cognitive science. Like James, I was an engineering student. I had a degree in aerospace engineering. So I like to joke that I've done rocket science and brain surgery, which I actually kind of have. But the work that I'm doing right now, way more difficult than either of those two things. And about 10 years ago, I realized that the work that I've been doing, which was about quantifying the link between individuals and whatever collective they're part of, that there was a way to quantify that and that it could potentially be applied to DEI. And I've been personally interested in DEI. I came to this country from Italy when I was a teenager, and immediately I thought, what the hell's wrong with people here? Like the way that black people are treated, the way that women are treated is just really, really weird. But I always thought, I'm a white guy, what can I do? I'm not an activist. And then 10 years ago, I had this light bulb moment where I thought maybe I can do something. So I'm gonna give you a bit of a whirlwind about what I do and what I talk about. And it's gonna also, I want to echo something that James said. I am motivated by issues of justice and fairness, but I also realize that a lot of the people that look like me are not. I also happen to believe that there are some misunderstandings about what white people who are in leadership positions are doing and why they're doing it, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I do think it's important. I love the way that James described it as a virus, or as a Trojan horse, or as a Trojan elephant in this case, right? And I think it's extremely important because change that's driven from within a tribe, in this case the white male tribe, is significantly more impactful than trying to change it from the outside. And so I hope you will appreciate that, and you'll appreciate the importance of having people who look like me actually being part of, stop being part of the problem, or at least, try to be part of the solution. So I also want to mention on the table over there, I have some flyers. I just published a book called Measuring Inclusion, and the subtitle is Higher Profits and Happier People Without Guesswork or Backlash. Started writing about a year and a half ago when the backlash was coming, and I thought I need to write this because I've come up with a solution that'll show you that really, really avoids the backlash and really gets a lot of people on board. And you don't need to do the QR code, because for those of you that are online, you can just look at the website, and for those of you that are on site, there are little postcards over there. And then tomorrow afternoon, so this conference officially ends at 11, which means about 11:55 it'll be over. And then at 12 we're going to start, and we actually we run a very tight ship. So this is a conference that's been going on for 7 years, just to give you an idea of the topics. And by the way, yesterday James described it as a bunch of academics. It's not. There are a few academics, but it's actually a bunch of case studies, panels, really fascinating topics that range from how do we deal, what's happened as a result of the Supreme Court abolishing affirmative action, and a number of other topics like that. So I hope that some of you will stick around. We will be mostly on Zoom. In fact, every presenter except for myself and my co-host, Leslie Short, who will be here tomorrow. Everybody else will be online, so we'll be very focused online, but several of you hopefully will still be here. So let me just tell you what I tell leaders that tries to convince them about why they should stop whining about DI and they should actually do something about it. And I try to take very, very neutral arguments. I always start with very, very neutral arguments that are focused on their interest and their business responsibilities as leaders. And I talk about the fact that if you think about every kind of asset that they manage, whether it's financial assets, whether it's marketing assets, whether it's products, they have tools to help them treat those assets as a portfolio. So we have programmatic advertising. And what does it do? Well, it helps us diversify our marketing assets to create more sales. Financial portfolio management, diversify your financial assets to get better returns, and so on and so forth. When it comes to people, no clue. We don't treat people as assets. We tend to treat them as something squishy that we don't know how to manage. What's really interesting about it is that this is counterproductive, because if you were to go into a company and ask them, what's going to happen if I could wave my magic wand and change it from being entirely homogeneous like the one on the upper left to entirely diverse like the one on the lower right, and asks the question of how is that going to impact my performance as a company, the answer is I have no clue. We might say that statistically over thousands of companies, there is a tendency for more diverse companies to perform better, but that's correlation, and people don't run companies by correlation. You never hear a CEO saying, well, on average, red cars do better, so let's make all of our cars red. Okay, so leaders just don't respond to that kind of data. So what do we do? Well, one of the things I point out to them is that you should really worry about the financial impact of your people. It's amazing to me that you do not take a portfolio management attitude toward your human resources, because if you look, for example, at the comparison in the United States between how much money companies spend on advertising in 1 year across all forms of advertising versus how much they spend on payroll, and I ask people sometimes, I do a poll, which one is bigger? And some people say payroll, some people say advertising. What very few people realize is that across the United States, we spend 30 times more on our people than we do on our advertising, 30 times more. So what I tell the CEO is, how is it that your largest budget item and your most expensive and valuable resource in the organization is the one that you treat the least well and that you don't even know how to manage it? If you have 10 people working in programmatic advertising, you should have 300 people working in DI. At which point they kind of laugh at me, but then they kind of go like, okay, maybe we should do that. So I point out to them, they're failing their companies. If they do not know how to create better organizations by, through DI, by diversifying their portfolio of human beings, they're making a huge mistake. A lot of the problem that I've seen, and I think this is where the backlash, in my book, there are a couple of chapters in the back where I point out some of the reasons that I think that we in the field of DI have made some big mistakes that have, I think, actually led to a lot of the backlash. And then I have another chapter in which I talk about how the people that are against DI are making a lot of really, really silly mistakes as well. But I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to be very candid about it, right? I think that there's a problem, which is that even though we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice, access, et cetera, the vast majority of the initiatives and virtually the entirety of the data that anybody ever refers to is only looking at the D. And this is a big, big, big problem, okay? And let me explain why. Imagine you're in a company that has 1,000 people today. And those 1,000 people, you have 20% who identify as white women, 5% as women of color, 5% men of color. So it looks something like that. The rest of them are white men, just like the little chart that you see over there. And imagine that the CEO comes along and says, oh, I see the light. DI is great. We're going to increase the number of white women to 30%, white or women of color to 8%, and men of color to 8%. But don't worry, because DI is so great, the company's going to grow by 20%, and so we're all going to be happy, right? Well, wrong, because unless the company like triples in size, you're going to find that the only way to get there is to reduce the number of white men. And I'm sorry, but this is reverse discrimination based on race and gender. This is why the Supreme Court eliminated, why basically they're now eliminating across a whole bunch of things. Now, if you look narrowly and you only think about it in terms of the overall composition of the company, this argument is right. But it turns out that this argument is profoundly flawed because it does not realize what is actually happening in organizations. And let me show you what I mean by that, if I can actually advance there. The problem that we're doing is that we're trying to fix the symptoms. Imagine you walk into your house one day and you feel that it's really cold as it was this morning in this room, and then we'd ask them to turn up the temperature a bit. You look at the thermostat, it says 50 degrees. I know how to fix it. Light a match under it. Oh, look, the temperature now is 60, 70, 80, 90 degrees. Meanwhile, the windows are open, the front door is drafty, and you're gonna burn the house down. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're burning the house down. Instead, what we need to realize is to look at data. By the way, the reason why I use those 4 buckets is that that's what McKinsey and Lean In show every year. And one interesting chart is that if you look at the entry-level representation of those 4 groups across the United States, white men make up 35% of the population. But look at what happens as they advance through the organization. They pick up more than 20% of representation at the expense of all the other groups. So the problem is not that we have to stuff more people into a system that does not treat them well. The problem is that we have a leaky bucket. And pouring more water in from the top is just gonna make a big mess on the floor. And that's the problem, is that we're creating this kind of backlash without even realizing it. Now, I've come up through the work, I'm not gonna have a lot of time to show you the details, but I built these computer simulations that are kind of like little Sims games. But I've come up with a very, very simple set of definitions. And that is, inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get, and equity is what you want. And if you think, and by the way, this is from the point of view of the organization. One big problem that I see with the definitions is that sometimes people define things in terms of the people, or sometimes in terms of the organization, sometimes in terms of the policies. I think about it just from the point of view, if I'm an organization, everything that I do, everything that happens to my people is what I describe inclusion. Diversity is the result of that, and I'll explain why I say that equity is what I want. Inclusion is what you do. Well, imagine you have a team, and this team is the perfect team, meaning that each person is performing at their peak, and as a team that work really, really well. You cannot get any better performance in this team. And now imagine that something happens to one individual that makes them unable to perform at their peak. What will happen to the performance of the team? It's gonna drop. What happens if a second person has a similar problem? It's gonna drop even more. Not only that, but now the rest of the team is gonna get frustrated because they'll have to pick up the slack. Maybe they will drop the ball on one of the projects, and then the manager will say, no, I'm no longer gonna give you the best projects. So very soon the entire team's performance drops dramatically. Now, I haven't said anything about race, gender, sexual orientation, nothing, right? This is a very, very general argument that leads to a very powerful conclusion, which is that anything that an organization does that causes any of its employees to underperform because of their personal traits is shooting itself in the foot. It's having a negative impact on the entire organization. And I want you to think about that, right? Because this is, again, this is nothing to do with DEI. This is like a very generic statement, but very clearly where the DEI comes in is that if you're treating people differently because of their personal traits that have nothing to do with their ability to work, you're creating problems. You're literally bleeding out money. And if you think about it, it makes sense. We talk about how companies treat people. It's not like a building says, oh, look, there's black people coming, shut the doors. No, the company is the collection of all the people in the organization, and it's about every single thing that every person does and how it impacts other people around them, from the CEO all the way down to the last person at the bottom of the pile. So the way that I think about it is that when you go to work, your satisfaction has a profound impact on your ability to, it's basically, it impacts how well you're gonna work, how long you're gonna stay with the company. But what is satisfaction? Well, satisfaction is about all the things, all these categories of things that go on in your work life. So work-life balance, compensation and benefits, career progression, being respected, being recognized. And here's the key, what I mean by the fact that inclusion is about what you do. To the extent that different people have different experiences, they will have different levels of satisfaction. And that's what inclusion is all about. Inclusion is about kind of the fabric of everything that happens day in and day out, every single action, every single thing that you experience. If you have different experiences because of your gender, your race, your disabilities, then your organization is not inclusive, okay? So inclusion is about what you do. Now, what about, I said that I can also say that inclusion, that diversity is what you get. And it turns out that, by the way, I don't have time to show you later if anybody wants to see these computer simulations where you can literally replicate amazingly accurately data about how if you are less inclusive towards certain groups, you get the kinds of biases and the kinds of imbalances that you see in the real world. But I want to point out something about the performance, because this is what really hurts the bottom line for people that actually care, the white leaders that look like me. We developed a calculator in which, just by knowing how many people a company has and what demographic buckets they fall into, and if we know their satisfaction level, or we have a way of measuring inclusion, but it's comparable, we can tell them more or less exactly how much money they're probably losing without realizing it, because of two things: lower productivity and lower retention rates. And it's really very obvious. If you have 500 people who are white men and 500 people who are not white men, and the average satisfaction of the white man is 90, whatever that means, and for everybody else it's 80, then it means that those 80% people will produce less, which means that your top line is gonna go down, and they're gonna be more likely to leave. You have to replace them, which means that you have a greater cost. And basically those charts show that. These numbers are pretty significant. We calculate that a typical company is losing around 20% of their net profits without realizing it. In 2022, there was a memo leaked from Amazon. By their own estimation, this is a company that made $32 billion in profits that year. By their own estimation, they were losing $8 billion a year in unwanted churn. So these are real big numbers. So when I go to a CEO and I give them the spiel and I say, hey, how big is your company, 2,000 people? My guess is you're losing $15 to $20 million a year and you don't even realize it. And you're losing it just by being dumb about the way that you treat people. They start to pay a lot of attention. And by the way, I haven't said anything, I mean, I mentioned it here in passing, but I can do this entire talk without saying anything about justice, anything about fairness, anything about race, anything about disability. Because ultimately, that's kind of what motivated me to get into this space, was the fact that everybody was like, oh, you know, diversity is great and it creates greater innovation. I'm sorry to say, but if you get outside of our own bubble and you look really hard, try to find the really hardcore data that shows that diverse teams perform better. And I can guarantee you that even there are like large organizations that were pro-DI that invested millions of dollars in huge studies that basically prove very conclusively that yes, in some cases, diverse teams perform better. In some cases, they perform worse. And in many cases, it doesn't make any difference. And we have a tendency to latch on to the things that we like. You know, it's one of the unconscious biases. It's selection bias. And so we get into these arguments where, you know, the leaders are looking at one thing, we're looking at something different, and we just keep arguing in our own bubbles, and we just have to be very careful about that. Instead, what I submit to you is that the reality is that inclusion is the root of a company that is more diverse because you're no longer leaking out people. It's more highly performing. And why do I say more equitable? The reason why I said equity is what you want is because if you have an inequity, it costs you money. So if you're the CEO of a company and you spot that inequity, you're like, oh crap, I'm losing money. So let me fix that, which gives you also a really nice target. One of the things that drives me also bonkers is this idea of these percentage representation targets, because there are just so many complexities with that. Here, there's a very simple target: find inequities and drive them to zero. Who is going to complain about that? What white man, and by the way, when we measure inclusion, the number of complaints we get from white men about being discriminated against is really disgusting. It makes me not very proud to be a white man. But on the other hand, you don't know your privilege. So if all of a sudden somebody comes and takes away your dog food, it's gonna suck. And just because the other person was eating worse than you were, it's not gonna make you feel any better. It's still really, really bad. So I'm not gonna go into the details of why we measure inclusion, but I just wanna show you one very important analogy before I stop and we talk about the mapping. I realized something very profound about inclusion that I think is at the heart of why so few people measure it and so few people even really know what to do about it, and why there's so many different definitions of it. Inclusion itself is invisible. It's like health, right? I didn't introduce myself to say, hi, I'm Paolo, I'm very healthy today. But earlier, I was having a conversation with someone about the fact that I've been having problems with lungs and allergies, and they're like, oh, have some vitamin. So what's the point? You don't notice when you're healthy, you tend to notice when you're sick. Inclusion is the same way, it's like privilege. You tend not to notice when you are included, you're more likely to notice when you're being excluded. Now, here's what's interesting about that. So, not only does it mean that we're less likely to notice it if we enjoy it, but think about health, right? If you're very healthy, you probably don't even know the name of diseases. You don't know what the symptoms are. If somebody tells you, you have no idea how severe the symptoms really are, and you sure as heck do not know how to cure the diseases. And the same exact thing is true with exclusion. Exclusion is hardest to see for those who enjoy it the most. So if you're included all the time, you have no idea what the symptoms are, and you don't know how to fix it. But in a typical company, who are the most included people? The leaders, which means that the very people that are the ones that have to make all the decisions are the least qualified to understand what exclusion means, what it looks like, how severe it is, or how to fix it. My belief, and I talk to a lot of people that look like me, is that the vast majority of white men are not trying to hold on to the power. They're not trying to get revenge. They're not trying to, do claims of reverse discrimination. They just don't see it. They don't know what the hell to do. So we go there and we scream louder, and they just freak out and they don't know what to do about it. I know a lot of leaders that since the backlash, they want to do DI, but they're like, sigh of relief because people are no longer screaming at me in my face about something that I do not want to know anything about. So what I would urge all of us to do is to think about the fact that, again, we all, and when I say we all, I've been in this space for 10 years, so I kind of sort of understand what it's like not to look like me. I will never actually truly understand it, but most people that look like me have no clue. And just yelling at them or telling them, as James was saying earlier, was talking about the idea, or actually somebody else was talking about, when you see sometimes, and this has not happened recently, but, oh, if you're white, you're an oppressor. When you go on and talk to people like that, it's just not a very good way to sell a product. So we ended up taking the same analogy. I'm not gonna give you a lot of detail, but just like a doctor asks you about symptoms, they don't just say, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, how healthy are you? Imagine you go to the doctor, it's like, how healthy do you feel today? Oh, 7, take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. Or even better, what do we ask people in our companies? Do you feel that our organization creates a strong sense of belonging? So imagine going to your doctor and say, do you feel that our hospital does a really good job with its patients? And that's all they ask you. It would never work, right? So what we do is we have created a way of measuring inclusion where we ask people through a very confidential, completely confidential anonymous platform to share specific experiences of things that happen to them at work, not things that made them feel excluded, just things that happened to you. It could be somebody came and touched my hair inappropriately, somebody made a pass at me, but it could also be I didn't get invited to a meeting in which I should have belonged, or somebody asked me to, get the coffee for everybody without realizing that it was the VP. And when you measure that and you realize that, oh, that happens a lot more to black women than it happens to white men, or it happens a lot more to gay people than it does to heterosexual people, you can get some amazing data. And so what we do is we basically ask people, okay, tell us about, remember those bubbles that I had, like tell us about what kind of thing happened to you. So describe a little story of what thing that happened to you. Tell us what kind of category it belongs in. And then tell us, why did it happen? Was it because of a policy? Was it because of your leadership? Was it your management? Was it your peers? And why is this not showing up there? For some reason, the slide is not updating. Oh, there we go. Just a little bit of a delay. And it turns out that when you collect, anyway, there were all these sources of where these experiences are coming from. And when you combine those, the quantitative data tells you these categories, the sources, the identity traits, tells you where the biggest opportunities. And then the qualitative data in terms of the experience description tells you exactly what is happening. And we get, again, I'm not going to go into, but just to give you an idea, we did a study for the field of cybersecurity earlier this year, and we found that in general, in the field of cybersecurity, women have 2.1 times higher exclusion scores than men. And when you look across all those categories, you find that in some categories, the discrepancy is as much as 4.5 times. So women complain about, or they describe experiences in which their skills were ignored or not recognized 4.5 times as much as men. And then we wonder why women leave organizations. Same things happen with race and ethnicity, although these days I have to say, race, the difference is getting blurred because the white people are complaining so much about reverse discrimination. And they are, and the fact is, if I'm a boss and my person is complaining, I'm not gonna sit there and say, oh, you're a whiny person because you shouldn't complain. They're complaining. And that unfortunately has a very negative impact, which is why you're seeing so many companies backing away from DI, because it's not only their customers that are complaining, but it's also their employees that are complaining. So, and then we can do things like we can look at different identity traits. We see intersectionality in the data. We don't ask about intersectionality. We ask people to give them the demographic data, but the descriptions, they don't focus on that. But we can collect the data and you can literally see things like intersectionality. We call it degrees of diversity. There's various ways of calculating that. So lots of benefits to focusing on inclusion instead of diversity. Again, I don't want to take too much time, but basically, it's a new measurement. And by the way, one thing that I always tell people, I'm not saying throw away diversity, focus on inclusion. Diversity is like your balance sheet. And I tell people sometimes, would you like to be a CFO and only be able to manage your company through your balance sheet? The balance sheet tells you what is happening today as a result, but it tells you, you know that it's the result of everything that's happened in the past, but you don't know why. Just like the diversity of a company tells you there is a problem, but it doesn't tell you why. Inclusion is like the cash flow. It's all the day-to-day stuff that makes some people more satisfied and some people less satisfied. And you need both. And you need to track those over time, which is a bit like your P&L if you know about the financial statements. And so it's giving you real-time measurements, and it doesn't piss people off. Because ultimately, everybody understands what it's like to be excluded, and everybody understands that it's actually beneficial to make sure that everybody's included. And that's therefore the title of the book, which is Greater Performance and Happier People Without the Guesswork or Backlash. Now, for the last 7 years, I've been organizing this conference, the Diversity and Inclusion Research Conference. And a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago, James and I met, and he started to tell me about what he was doing. And he spoke at one of the DIRC conferences, and then he spoke again last year, and then it was like, we should really join forces. And initially, I didn't understand. And then finally, when I understood what he was doing, I was like, I get it. We have to partner. And so we decided to bring these two together because ultimately, what we're trying to do is to show how research can help to bring rigor to some of the work that is done. Measurement, looking at impact, quantifying impact, understanding how to define impact in a way that makes sense to business people. But what James is doing, what the ISM is proposing, is crucial because ultimately, as he was saying, we're not an industry yet. And we need to understand what we're gonna offer companies. They need to understand where does it fit and how does it fit. And so we started to spend some time together. We also happen to be neighbors. We live within less than a mile of each other up in Harlem. And we started to map out the industry to really codify the parameters of DEI and then use it to understand where each organization that offers any kind of services actually fits into the overall map. And one of the things that we ended up doing is that taking an inspiration from, I don't know if any of you have ever done like work in marketing, but there used to be this thing called Lumascapes. and it was started by a company called Luma Partners, where they started to map out companies in the digital space and the marketing space. This one is particularly messy, but it's one actually from the website. But so we thought, why don't we do, actually James thought we want to do something similar using the categories and the service categories and the various ideas that you heard about today. And so what we ended up doing is that we created a spreadsheet, and this is really my very small contribution, is that we created an interactive spreadsheet in this system called Airtable, where anybody can enter the name of an organization and enter a few data points about it. There is a public version if you go to that bit.ly address right there. And right now the data is kind of, we just like threw in a few names in there, but that's not like real data yet. But what we were hoping to do, starting with what we're doing right now, is to invite people to go to, there's a form where you can actually submit, excuse me, where you can actually submit information about organizations that you know working in the space. And if it's the organization that you work for, then if you're a DI provider, then please put in as much detail as you can. But even if you just know the name and the URL, just enter it in there, and then James's team, our team, will do some due diligence. And ultimately, the goal is to try to create a mapping that matches with a service management schematic idea, so that we can actually get a much better sense of where we all fit in, both as providers, but also the leaders that need to understand, oh, who do I need? Oh, I need a little bit of this, I need a little bit of that, I need a bit of measuring inclusion, but I also need people that can do justice work, and they will know who to turn to, they will know what to expect, and the people that are providing these services will know exactly how to interface, and will be able to probably charge a lot more money and do less work in the process of doing that.
And that's really what we want. More money, less work.
More money, less work. That's it. I think that was my last slide.
Thank you so much, Paolo. I love this contrast. I love his talk. He also has a great TED talk. I know we got back a little late from lunch, so we are over. We want to let everybody go. Are there any questions, musings? Does anybody hate money and corporations? Or can we have a dangerous conversation? Anyone want to do knife fighting? Anything later on the day? I'll be wearing all leather. You can hit me where you want. No? Okay. Well,
and I'll be I'll try my best to be quick. You know, when you first started out, you were talking about the white elephant and all that. The challenge that I have, and I have shared this with colleagues throughout the many years that I've been doing this work, is that even if I don't mention diversity or equity, I come in looking like me. And even with my educational background, the vast experience that I have, a white male coming into that space is going to just come in, and they can hear him differently than they hear me.
Yep.
But I'm the one that has to carry the message. So I've learned over the years, you know, like I mentioned earlier, you know, being a temperate radical, I have been dealing with that all my life. I remember when I was working for a Veterans Museum, and I was the person that was in charge of the visitors and, you know, and the tours and things, and the docents. And we would have people come in off the street to ask. No one would come to me, but I was the person with the answers. And so that is a challenge. And it just so happens that many of the people that are leading this work, not to say they look exclusively like me, but many of us do identify in those groups. And so I just, you know, given that you're saying I agree with you that it's not, you know, you're saying make more of a big, not just the business case, but to look at the numbers. So I do appreciate that message, and that is a tool. I will be sure I'm definitely going to get your book and study it. But I also think that there is that other layer of someone with my identity actually leading and doing the work.
Yeah. So I'm keenly aware of that. I had the privilege years ago when I first started working in this space. I joined a woman, Gilda Berabino. I don't know how many of you may know her, but Gilda Berabino is like one of the, and you would know Gilda. Gilda is like truly the most amazing human being that I know. Black woman, was recently president of the AAAS, is now president of Olin College of Engineering, was president of the Biomedical Engineering Society of America. This is like the most impressive human being. Like she trims stuff off her CV because it's too long, that anyone in this room, including me, would put it at the very top of their list, okay? So this is what she's like. So we're talking to the president of the City College of New York, where she was the dean of the School of Engineering. She's bringing me in, and paying me to work with her and collaborate on getting some grants and doing some things. We're sitting across the table, and the guy is looking at me, talking to me as if I'm God's gift to DEI, and I'm literally sitting there like scooching over next to Gilda's going like, no, it's like talk to her, right? So I've seen it, and what I try to do, I feel like I have a responsibility. I have a responsibility because I can use my platform, and if they will not listen to you, then I can lend you my voice, and I can try to do my best to translate in a way that is not going to lose the message that you care about. Because ultimately, one of the things that I realize is that when I go into a typical room and I'm talking to a lot of companies, I'm talking to the white male CEO, but the potentially black, female, queer, indigenous chief diversity officer, or maybe not even the chief diversity officer, is in the room too, and they have to buy what I'm selling in a way. They have to understand that what I'm saying is actually beneficial to everyone. So keenly aware of that, all I can say is I think we need more people who look like me to recognize that we are the problem. And I'm very clear about that. We are the problem. We continue to perpetuate the problem. Being passive is not good. I think that, again, trying to use our power, this incredible privilege that we have in the right way is really the best that I can possibly do when I can. And I do try to surround myself with people who do not all have the same experiences that I have. But I completely appreciate it. It makes me sick to my stomach every time that I deal with that. But I'll do what I can, and hopefully 10 years from now, things will be a little bit easier for everyone.
Pay it forward. Keep paying it forward.
You gotta pay it forward. You gotta do that.
You know what though? I don't see you as the problem, right? And the example that you're sharing, someone sees you and sees you like you, right? Someone sees you and sees you like you. The person that's seeing is the one that I'm trying to reach at. The person I'm seeing is the one I'm trying to impact, to have people to see things differently. Chances are this person might not have the experience, the knowledge, the living situations that some people might have. But I think it's us as practitioners to get the sooner we get these people to understand these people, the sooner we're able to move this thing forward a little bit, right? Because it's for me, it's hard to move DEI forward if we don't have the people that look like him who are at the top of the house, because they're the ones that make the decisions. They're the ones that have the tools, the resources, the monies, and we actually need them to move this all forward. I get what you're saying, 100%, but the message I'm trying to deliver is like, we need it all. We need it all. It takes all of us to get this going together, and the sooner that we're able to do the sooner that we're able to do this together than separately in our own different communities. I think together we're stronger than trying to do it by ourselves.
And I agree,
That's-
but I think the first.
Use the microphone.
But the devil's in the details, right? So you're new. You've been in, as a matter of fact, going into the environment that I'm in, I'm still learning about associations and how they operate. And so I agree to a certain extent that absolutely, it's a collective, I think we all have a collective responsibility to get there, but working on a culture that doesn't have that collective responsibility mindset yet, it starts with planting the seeds. And so when you're going to a space that you're not always seen or respected just because of your identity, that's part of what your work is to establish that level of respect and value. So that's what we're working, I think that's what we're working towards, is getting to that place where then we can talk about ISO standard.
Yeah.
These are the things that we should be doing. But we have to grow our leaders too.
Yeah. Well, there was another question or comment.
Totally support what Dr. Black is talking about. We're working together on a National Science Foundation funded grant. Last night, us and other colleagues received a FOIA request from a known anti-DEI activist who happens to be white, happens to be male. That individual is trying to disrupt decades of work. As a white male ally, are there strategies that you know can be useful to address or counter this type of work, because what's happening is leaders feel attacked. They're not prepared to deal with a white male colleague that is calling them out, and so they begin to fold the DEI efforts. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm gravely concerned about that. I won't tell you like what I would really like to do with those people. Probably would not be appropriate, but see the problem is that the problem is that there is like it's a very long chain of events, right? So something happens that creates, and by the way, one of the reasons why I got excited about working in this space is that I have among other privileges, a lot of the things that happen to virtually everybody else in this room, they don't happen to me, which means that I can study and see what happens. I can be disgusted by it, but ultimately it only impacts me so much, right? Which means that I can detach myself and see things in a slightly different way. But one of the things that became very clear as I became more educated, and I'm still very ignorant about a lot of these things, but it became very obvious very quickly that racism in this country and in a lot of places is motivated by economics very, very clearly, right? So we have an economic desire, and what we do, we hire pseudoscientists, in 1619 and later to tell people that, Africans are not actually human beings. They're not quite animals, but they're not quite human beings either, right? And by doing that, you justify the fact that all of these, Protestant, presumably Christian people are treating people the way that they are. And then what that does is that it engenders a sense of otherness and a sense of hatred and a sense of like that, which then takes, centuries. So I don't believe that we're gonna be able to fight that just by head on, right? I'm trying to build an argument where I understand how important it is to go and get in people's heads and change their minds about how they see people. But I think that one way to do it, and you need all of them, one way that I can do it is to come in through the wallet and basically convince them that this is what they want to do. Now, the problem with what you were saying about people like Mr. Starbuck and some of these other people that are doing things like that is that they are the tail end of a chain reaction of a movement. The movement then leads to backlash. There are people that are very, very evil. And by the way, when I said that a lot of white leaders are not actually like evil white supremacists, there are some that are. There are people that are very, very evil who purposefully are doing this because they want to hold down they want to hold down women, they want to hold down people of color, they want to hold down, everybody, indigenous peoples, everybody, right? So I'm aware of that, and we need the kind of things that everybody else in this room has the skills to do that I don't have. But I think that the only way we're gonna ever counter that is to start to spread the word about the fact that, yeah, let's acknowledge that some of the criticism that is being raised is not wrong. Some of the criticism is actually not wrong. And let's acknowledge that that's the case, but let's recognize that the motivation. Why did the Supreme Court choose to do something 50 years ago that they felt was just? Because instead of just looking like this, they looked and they said, there is something really wrong with the way that black people are treated in this country and the way that women are treated in this country. And that's not fair. So even though the law itself, affirmative action, was written in a way which can legitimately be seen as being discriminatory, right, reverse discriminatory, in the context of a society in which very clearly there is a lot of discrimination against one group, it makes perfect sense. But now that gets lost, right? And now it's the white people that are complaining that they're being discriminated against. So my only hope is that as people kind of step back, there will be some retrenchment. It's gonna be unavoidable, especially when you have the Supreme Court that we have right now. And not just the Supreme Court, but the entire judiciary, the way that it's been skewed is a big, 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 big problem, which unfortunately means that it's gonna take significantly longer to get rid of some of these problems. But I do think that getting back to basics and thinking about, okay, how can we avoid some of the mistakes that we've made? How can we get away, instead of screaming louder the same things that we've been screaming, can we come up with different arguments? Can we come up with different ways of looking at it? My hope is that will start to knock some sense into people. And by the way, if anybody knows Mr. Starbuck or what's the other guy's name, I try to forget these people's names, and they want to do a debate, I'd be more than happy to do a debate with one of them. So, but it's a big problem, and it's terrible, and
One more question.
Yeah, actually, it's not a question. I love your work. Thank goodness we need this. Doesn't this fill a gap?
Thank you.
Yeah, it fills a gap. I just, y'all, I'm a lawyer, I'm a professor, and there are just certain things I can't let go because I know all of us that are at a different knowledge level. So I do want to make clear, and James, you had said this before, there is no such thing as reverse discrimination in the law. The law covers everyone, including white folks. Saying reverse discrimination was their nonsense. okay, acting like they were being discriminated against in some other way. The other thing, and it may seem like a little thing, but it's not, is affirmative action. Affirmative action was not an extension of the law. It was not about reparations. It is about you are presently feeling the effects of discrimination, and they will be remedied by this. Okay? And one of the arguments that white folks used was, I did not do this. This is the sins of my father kind of argument. It's not about your father. This is about what we are feeling today, which of course makes all sorts of sense given how the system was set up, that there would be the kind of differences that you saw in treatment. I just want to say that because we all come from different places, we're all going back to different places, and I don't want us to carry with us the language that furthers these nonsensical arguments that they have made to make the law look like it was doing something it was not doing for so long.
That's really good. That's really good. I do want to, if I may add just one little thing about what you said though. We have a tendency, so this is something that I see all the time. By the way, I don't know if I call it privilege, I was invited on 2 occasions to go be part of what was called a heterodox conversation at 2 universities in Canada. The fact that it was Canada was coincidental, in which there was one person pro-DEI and one person kind of anti-DEI. I was, you might imagine, the pro-DEI person. And in one of them in particular, I was like deep behind enemy lines. And what really freaked me out is that I was talking to an audience full of people. I was getting heckled by a bunch of white people who, to them, the terms DEI and woke were insults. And they'd only ever heard them in a very negative way. So DI to them was an ideology that was like about telling people that all white people are horrible, and woke was an insult. It was like literally, and you've all heard it, right? Now here's the problem. If I came to you and said, is woke a bad term, you would probably say no. But the same thing is with reverse discrimination. Here's what's happening. There are people in companies that are being told verbatim, I did not promote you because we had to promote a black person. That is reverse discrimination. So when people say reverse discrimination, don't interpret it in terms of, oh, come on, you gotta be kidding, it's not reverse discrimination because that's not what the law says. These are words that people are taught to use against us. They take those words and they twist them. That's where the evil people really, the horrible kind of media machine that twists these things. And so we just have to be mindful. Again, I get angry when people use words like reverse discrimination, but getting angry about that and complaining that that's not the right term to use, you have to be careful, because if you say that to a white man or some white women, they will not understand you. They will not understand you. So I urge you, like try really hard. Like what a lot of white people fail to do is that they have no idea what it means not to be white. But I would submit to you that a lot of you probably don't really know what it's like to be white. Just like, I don't know what it's like not to be white. And we have to be very careful, because a lot of times what I see is people fighting over words that we use to abstract years of experiences or months of experiences, and we try to interpret what they mean to us. And so we just have to be very, very careful about that. But anyway, these are great conversations. Would love to continue to entertain some of them offline. Also tomorrow, please, again, 12 to 6, we'll be here with a bunch of really interesting presentations.